Hi, my name's Andy Cutting and I work for the National Autistic Society. I run the School Exclusions Helpline. Now normally at this time of year I would be talking to delegates or attendees at the autism show. But this year, because of the COVID-19 restrictions, that's had to be cancelled. Instead, we've been asked to record our seminars, and that's what I'm going to try and do for you this afternoon, although it's the first time I've ever done it, I have to admit. Right, so today I'm going to be talking to you about preventing and challenging school exclusion. So there's three things I'm going to be talking about today. Why is it that autistic children and young people are more likely to be excluded than children who don't have special educational needs? I'll be talking about how we might prevent school exclusion from happening in the first place, and then I'll be finishing with talking about how parents can challenge a school exclusion. And you'll notice that I'm sneakily looking over to the left every now and again, and that's because I've got my PowerPoint running here, a PowerPoint that I would normally be showing as part of my seminar, but we'll do the best we can. Okay, so how can we say that more exclusions occur for autistic children than children who don't have special needs? Well, every time a head teacher excludes a child, that data is collected on a nationwide basis, and once a year those statistics are released. So the most up-to-date information we have comes from the academic year 2018-2019, and those show that a staggering 5,607 autistic children and young people were given at least one fixed period exclusion in that year. And that means that they are twice as likely to be excluded as children who don't have special needs. Now, before we sort of fully explore why that might be the case, I think it's worth just talking about the differences that autistic children and adults all share to a greater or lesser degree. So those are differences in social communication, social interaction, repetitive behaviour and routines, highly focused interests, and sensory sensitivities. And I use the word differences intentionally because for many autistic people they can be viewed as a very positive thing. We think of, say, Chris Packham, for example, who is on the autism spectrum. He's made a highly successful career out of his highly focused interest of wildlife. So the question is, what is it about school life that can turn those autistic differences into difficulties? Well, I've been lucky enough to speak to thousands of parents over the last 7 years running the School Exclusions Helpline. And there are some sort of common happenings, if that's the right word, that happen at school involving autistic children. And I'll just run through some of those now. So sudden changes of teacher and to the school timetable. So having a supply teacher unexpectedly taking the class can cause anxiety for an autistic child, for example. They're not familiar with that adult, they don't know what their expectations are, and so on. And changes to timetable. So the child might come to school thinking they're going to be doing English and maths as usual, and then find that there's a Shakespeare company doing drama work with the children. And that can cause anxiety, stress, and even distress for some autistic children. So the unstructured times of day, so break times and lunch times, can be particularly challenging for autistic children. It's a question of navigating that social and sensory world of the playground. It can be bewildering. They may find it difficult to join in with playground games, or they might take the playground rules, if you like, or rules of games very literally, and find it very difficult if children sort of are a bit flexible with those rules. An autistic child might misunderstand social rules. So in the classroom, they might call out or interrupt or maybe even correct the teacher. So they can appear quite rude. Working cooperatively in class maybe, or even in team games, in PE for example. Taking things literally, so misunderstanding sarcasm, jokes, banter and dares. So an example of that might be if a teacher leant on an autistic child's desk and said, "Am I boring you?" An autistic child might say, "Yes, you are," taking it very literally, whereas another child, of course, would zip up, wouldn't say anything. Okay, next up we have personal space. This is a very common difficulty, particularly if a child is in a heightened state of anxiety and distress. if there are people crowding around them or even using physical restraint, touching them, that can escalate a situation. Having difficulties with processing information. So a teacher might fire out, say, 3, 4, 5 instructions for the class. An autistic child might be struggling to understand the first one. And that means that they either are very slow to get their work done, or they may just shut down and not do the work at all. Another difficulty is bullying. Unfortunately, autistic children can be very vulnerable to the impacts of bullying. Some of those autistic differences, some children might find amusing, and then they might tease that child, unfortunately. And that can build up within that child over days and weeks and months, and then result in a meltdown. Or just generally a sensory overload. Light, sound, noise in the classroom can be overwhelming. Any of those things can build up over a period of time and result in what we often call an autistic meltdown. And that is basically a loss of control. And it can be shouting, swearing, often it can be quite violent, throwing things or lashing out at people. But often, when I speak to parents, they often say that their child has no memory of a meltdown. And when they're told that they have hurt, for example, their teaching assistant as a result of a meltdown, they can be full of remorse, or they might feel disengaged from their actions. And that to me tells me that shows that it's part of their autism, really. Something they don't really have any control over. But of course, a head teacher who has as a first priority the health and safety of staff and pupils, their first reaction might be to exclude that child. And there are, I would say, 2 broad reactions to exclusion from autistic children. On the one hand, autistic children can feel very rejected. Having a letter sent to their parents from the head teacher saying you're excluded for 3 days, for example, it's a bit like an official notification. You are not welcome at our school. And that clearly can undermine the child's self-confidence. It can lead to further anxiety, depression, school refusal, and in some cases long-term mental health difficulties. But the flip side of this is that for some autistic children, having an exclusion is like receiving Willy Wonka's golden ticket. It gives them the day off school. They can spend time in their room, away from all the noise and the social interaction of school life, shut themselves away in their own little sort of safe haven, if you like. But of course the fear there is that the child would then learn that by exhibiting more challenging behaviour at school, they get sent home, they're excluded. And that of course can then reinforce that negative behaviour. So what we tend to say is that for autistic children, exclusion doesn't improve their behaviour, and it doesn't act as a disincentive to act in the same way again, because their behaviour is so often intrinsically linked to their condition. So let's move on to how can we prevent exclusion. I'm going to start off by talking about educational entitlements. It's really important that schools and parents are aware of an autistic child's educational entitlements. For me, the statutory guidance on exclusion, which are the rules that all state-funded schools in England have to follow in terms of exclusion, for me the standout headline from that document is that disruptive behaviour can be an indication of unmet needs. And the guidance goes on to say that for any child who's exhibiting more challenging behaviour, a first step is to implement an SEN support, assess, plan, do, review cycle, also called school support. But if the school is feeling that they can't, under their own steam or their own resources, perhaps I should say, support that child, then that might well be the time for the school or the parent to make a request to the local authority for an assessment of that child's education and healthcare needs. And that's the process that can lead, in some cases, to the issue of an education health plan, EHC plan. Sometimes, however, when parents suggest that, schools can sometimes be dismissive. The child, for example, might academically be able or more able than many children in the class. And because it's also an invisible condition, it's not always obvious that that child is having significant difficulties. But the Special Educational Needs Code of Practice, which are the rules that schools and local authorities have to follow in terms of special needs, says that there are 4 areas of need that are assessed. It's not just, one of those is cognition and learning, so that's more the academic side. But the other 3 are communication and interaction, social, emotional and mental health difficulties, and sensory and or physical needs. And for autistic children and young people, they are likely to have needs across all of those areas. And that's something that the Code of Practice does highlight in paragraphs 6.27 to 6.34, in case you're interested. Okay, a child, of course, might already have an education and healthcare plan, and they may be being excluded. If that is the case, the statutory guidance does suggest that it might be appropriate to request an emergency review of that EHC plan to see whether that child's needs have changed. Maybe they need some more support, maybe they need some intervention from an occupational therapist or speech and language therapist, for example. Also, a school can seek advice. Obviously no school is an island, and they're not expected to be experts in everything. So they might it might be appropriate to contact a local autism advisory service, or outreach team as they're sometimes called, or an education psychologist, for example. And another key aspect, of course, is that the school should be making reasonable adjustments for disabled pupils. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And that's to both policies and practices. Okay, if you'd like some more advice on those sort of issues, then we have an education rights helpline. And you can find them on our NAS website by just searching for Education Rights Helpline, or the phone number is 0808 800 4102. Also, there's a guide that we produced which goes into a bit more detail about those steps that we've talked about. The guide is called Steps to Avoid the Exclusion of Autistic Pupils. It will be back on our website soon, but at the moment we are going for a bit of a sort of refit, if you like, and it's not there yet. So if you would like a copy of that guide, by all means drop me an email, and the way to do that is to email the School Exclusions Helpline. The email address for that service is schoolexclusions, with an S at the end there, at nas.org.uk. Okay, second up, in terms of preventing school exclusion, a key thing is to know the child's rights under the Equality Act. Now, autism is generally considered to be a disability for the purposes of the Equality Act, Section 6. And that triggers a school's duty to make reasonable adjustments. Simply put, reasonable adjustments are changes to the way that a school usually does things, so that a disabled child is not put at a substantial disadvantage compared to non-disabled children. This duty is an anticipatory duty, and that means that schools need to think in advance about what a disabled child might need. So it's not a question of 4 or 5 weeks of the term going by and then thinking this child is struggling a bit, what should we do? It should be a question of working with families before the child even starts at the school, and agreeing some reasonable adjustments that they could be making as soon as that child starts on the 1st of September or whenever it might be. Another key thing about the Equality Act is that it's okay to treat a disabled child more favourably than non-disabled children. I'll come back to that in just a minute, actually. In terms of discrimination, unfortunately, sometimes school exclusion can amount to disability discrimination. The most common one, in my experience, is discrimination arising from disability. And that is where a school treats a child or young person unfavourably. So, for example, excluding them from school is unfavourable treatment, and that is for a reason connected to their disability. So, for example, if you can show that the child's behaviour is linked in some way to their autism, then the school might, the treatment of the child might amount to unlawful discrimination arising from disability, unless the school didn't know about the child's disability and couldn't have reasonably been expected to know, or if they can justify that treatment. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. Another form of discrimination, which can also be quite common, unfortunately, is indirect disability discrimination. And in the world of exclusion, what we're talking about here is where a school is applying a blanket zero tolerance behaviour policy in the same way to all its students, but that has the effect of putting a group of students who share a protected characteristic, in this case disability, at a disadvantage. So what we'd say there is that autistic children, children with ADHD or Tourette syndrome, for example, PDA, are much more likely to break the school rules kind of inadvertently. You know, they're more likely to be getting out of their seat and maybe talking to other children or touching other, just basically inadvertently disrupting lessons. But that is to do with their conditions. So if a school is very rigid about the application of their behaviour policy, this puts those children at a disadvantage. It means that they'll get excluded again and again and again. Just out of interest, again, it's the same test as with discrimination arising from disability. It won't be unlawful if the school didn't know about the child's disability or that they can justify the decision. And just on that, I'll just say that what we say is they can justify it if they can say it's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. The most common legitimate aim that I hear from head teachers is that we need to ensure the safety of staff and pupils in the school. And obviously you can't really argue with that. But what we do say is, is excluding them a proportionate way of doing that? Is that not like, using a sledgehammer to crack a nut? Surely, if you put in place certain reasonable adjustments for that child, it would mean that they're much less likely to get really stressed and anxious, and therefore much less likely to exhibit this much more challenging behaviour. Okay, and I think what I'll do so I'm just going to do something else first. First of all, let me just mention some common myths about behaviour policies, really. So, sometimes we hear, we've got a zero tolerance behaviour policy. It's the same rule for everybody. Or, the Equality Act means we have to treat everybody the same, that kind of thing. But as I was kind of hinting at back there, that's not true at all. I think one problem is that the Equality Act covers a range of protected characteristics like race, age, sex and so on. But disability and also pregnancy, out of interest, they're the only two where it's okay to treat somebody more favourably. So, for example, if there is an autistic child in class and they are unfortunately disrupting learning, it might be that the school policy is that we give the child detention or an exclusion, for example, but for an autistic child, they can actually think, well, actually, let's explore other options. What can we do instead of that? How can we help this child learn more socially appropriate ways of behaving in class? Okay, so in terms of exclusion again, before any exclusion, a head teacher should consider whether there's any contributing factors that have affected that incident in some way. So the guidance on exclusion talks about bullying, bereavement and mental health issues. But, if we sort of hone that down onto autistic children, we'd say, is the behaviour a direct consequence of that child's autism? Or was the behaviour triggered by some difficulties that child faced that are to do with or linked to their autism? Something that I find really useful and I strongly recommend is a guide called the Technical Guidance for Schools, produced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. It outlines the school duties, obligations under the Equality Act. It comes with lots of little examples which illustrate what is and what isn't disability discrimination. There is also another guide that the government have produced called the Equality Act 2010 Advice to Schools. Very similar really, but I tend to prefer the technical guidance. And I'm going to just sort of paraphrase one of the examples from that technical guidance just to illustrate how exclusion might amount to disability discrimination. So my favourite paragraph in that guidance is paragraph 4.11. And the example, I'm going to just slightly exaggerate a little bit. It talks about an autistic child who goes into school one day and finds that there's a supply teacher covering the class. And straight away he's on edge. He wasn't expecting it. A sudden change to his routine. He's getting very anxious. The supply teacher doesn't know this boy from any other child in the class and says, look, can you go and just sit over with that group of children over there? We're going to be doing some discussion about poetry or something like that. The child starts to get, really anxious and stressed by this. And all of a sudden, apparently out of the blue, the child sort of jumps up out of their seat, rushes up to the supply teacher, invading their personal space, and is flapping his arms around, apparently in a very aggressive way, towards her face and so on. And understandably, she feels quite intimidated by this behaviour, and the head teacher intervenes, and the child is given a fixed period exclusion. But then, following the incident, they look a little bit more, and they find that actually what had happened was that the class teacher hadn't left any notes for the supply teacher to say that that child was allowed to always sit in the same place in the classroom to reduce his anxieties, so he felt safe and secure. And on this occasion it wasn't done. And then also, when you actually analyse the behaviour that was going on there, the flapping arms that I talked about, that is what we would call stimming, self-stimulatory behaviour. And that's a behaviour that is a characteristic of autism. So another thing also was that the child invaded the teacher's personal space. And I mentioned earlier on that issues with personal space are a common difficulty for autistic children and young people. So the child was being punished for exhibiting their disability-related behaviour, we can call it really, their autistic behaviour. And the school wouldn't be able to justify that treatment because they'd failed to make reasonable adjustments for that child on that one day. They hadn't allowed the child to stay in the same place. They might also perhaps have sort of said, inform the parents maybe the night before, we've got a supply teacher covering the class tomorrow, here are some adjustments we're going to do instead. Maybe they can go into a parallel class, for example, with a teacher they know, something like that. Okay, so let's move on. Yeah, if you'd like to know a bit more about the discrimination side of things, we've got some information on our website on disability discrimination in schools, so you can search for that. We also have a guide to help parents navigate equality law, rights and entitlements when their autistic child is excluded or at risk of exclusion from school. And again, if you'd like a copy of that, if you want to just drop me an email, then I will get that to you as soon as I can. We also have got another guide to do with exclusion appeals to the first tier tribunal. So if a parent wants to take their case a bit further to what's called the first tier tribunal, we've got a guide that talks through that. Okay, yeah, I'm just going to give you a little quote actually. This came from a grandparent I spoke to once. And she said, talking about her grandson, she said, the school have painted Oscar as some sort of monster instead of my grandson who sleeps with 3 teddies, is scared of the dark and doesn't eat anything with a phaeton. And for me that unfortunately sort of summarises how when children are excluded, schools and parents and families can go on different paths. They can be going on divergent paths. It can break down that relationship, that constructive relationship between schools. Now, to help rebuild that relationship, or even just to help it sort of plod along happily, there's a guide from the Autism Education Trust which I find really useful. It's called Working Together with Your Child's School, and it's produced by the Autism Education Trust. It's got lots of nice little tips in there, but most of it, the bulk of it, is a questionnaire with 36, well, I won't call them questions, 36 statements about a child's autism needs. And the idea is that you as a family, go through those and you just decide how important they would be for your child. And you might, want to include your child in this as well, of course. So, for example, number 22 says your child has a safe and quiet place to go within the classroom or school when needed. So you either tick essential, important, not very important, and not necessary. When you've done all 36, the guide suggests you just pick your top 5 priorities and then arrange a meeting with the school. And I really like this because it gives parents a chance to share their own unique knowledge of their child, Nobody on planet Earth knows their child better than parents do. But sometimes when parents try and share that knowledge with the school, I think sometimes schools can sort of say, oh, we know best, we're the professionals here. Whereas using this guide from the Autism Education Trust gives a bit of more sort of clout to it, I think. So parents might find there are some things in there that they already do at home which are very effective, and this makes it sort of a bit more sort of formalised. The other thing I like about it is that it's positive. So you're going into school with 5 solutions, not 5 moans. You're not saying, oh, you failed to do this, you haven't done that, you promise you do this and it hasn't been done. You just say, look, here are 5 things that I think would make the world of difference to my child in school. How can we work together to make that happen? Okay, and we have a mine of information on our website, expanding all the time. We have an education section, so I would urge you to have a look at that. It's got a section, for example, on difficulties at break and lunch times. There's a section on what can I do if my child won't go to school. We used to call it school refusal, but now we tend to recognise that it's more to do with the child feeling unable to go into school because they are so stressed, and lots of other sections as well. I would also strongly recommend the Autism Education Trust website. They have a training program at different levels for school staff, and that training is all over England. They also have a wide range of education resources. So for example, there's one called Tools for Teachers, which is the only one that's got a cost implication, which is $35.99, so not bad, I don't think. And there's lots of resources in there which can help with everyday teaching and reasonable adjustments really for an autistic child. Also, I would strongly recommend the PDA Society website, Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome. Again, that's often a misunderstood condition, but there's lots of information for professionals and for parents on there. We also have Network Autism, which is an online community for education, sorry, not just education, for professionals, autism professionals, I should say. Lots of discussion groups on there, lots of shared resources and knowledge. Really, really good. On our website, the NAS website, we have a training and consultancy department who can provide bespoke training for schools. We also have a My World e-newsletter. It's free to subscribe, and there's lots of little tips there about autism that go out, every few weeks or so. Although we have been affected by lockdown, I have to admit. Also training. It's also important to know that initial teacher training now has to include an autism element. So that means that every new teacher coming into the profession will have some kind of grounding in autism, which is to be welcomed, of course. Okay, I was going to sort of round up with a few sort of little quotes that I picked up over the years. So these are from a couple of teachers. So they say, there is no quick fix or a one-size-fits-all set of strategies that can be used. So choose ways that the child is likely to enjoy and that the staff also enjoy, so that the school is a good place to be for all. Another one, get to know the child. Don't worry about the range of interventions. It's about how the people around the child behave. So if teachers and teaching assistants, lunchtime supervisors, if they are feeling relaxed and calm, then it's much more likely, of course, that the autistic child will be calm as well. Okay, and another two, I should say, that I really like. Here's a teacher saying, it is our problem. We solve problems. Any problems displayed by a child means that we haven't got something right. And I think that's so refreshing to hear that often, sadly, with exclusion, it's the onus is on the child, that they are the problem. The child has failed at school, when sometimes it's actually the school is failing the child. And it's about being reflective about your own practice and thinking about, what do we need to change about what we're doing at the moment? What don't we quite get yet? Another little quote here. We don't do this because we're nice people, although we are. We do it because kids who feel part of the school learn better. Okay, just to finish with just a very brief chat about how parents and carers can challenge a head teacher's decision to exclude their child. Parents have rights to make representations, in other words, to voice, if you like, their concerns and views about their child's exclusion. And those rights increase the greater the number of days that their child is excluded. So for exclusions totaling 5 days or fewer in one term, parents can write to the governors. The governors have to write back, but at that stage they don't really have any power. I'll come back to that in just a second. For exclusions totaling over 5 days, however, parents can request a meeting, and it's in that meeting that they would look at all the evidence, witness statements, head teacher's reports, listen to the parents and the child if that's appropriate as well, and they can decide either that the head teacher made the correct decision, in other words uphold the decision, or they can say that it was unjustified and direct reinstatement. But as I say, that doesn't the parents don't have that right for exclusions totaling 5 days or fewer in one term. So sometimes parents say, well, what's the point of me doing that then? What's the point of me writing if they can't do anything about it? But what I say there is that for some parents, they feel that they are making waves because they are making governors aware that there's an autistic child in year 4, for example, who is struggling, and the governors then should be holding the school to account and saying, well, what are we doing for this child? Have we considered an education and healthcare needs assessment? What reasonable adjustments have we made? Have we made reasonable adjustments to the school's behaviour policy? And so that it might then make the head teacher think twice in future before excluding the child again. We also have the school exclusions helpline, which I run. So if you have any specific questions about exclusion, fixed period exclusions, permanent exclusions, informal exclusions and so on, or part-time timetables as well, you can contact us on 0808 800 4002, or you can search for School Exclusion Helpline as part of the NES website. Okay, now if we were here at the Autism Show in Birmingham or Manchester or London, on the screen behind me I would now have a picture of Sigourney Weaver and Alien from the Alien film, where they're in very close proximity. And the reason for that is because, for me, it sums up what can go wrong. The relationship between schools and families can break down, and it can be very adversarial, very confrontational. Parents can sometimes feel very intimidated or frightened of the head teacher of the school. But equally, roles can be reversed. Sometimes parents can go into meetings with the school all guns blazing, saying you haven't done this, you haven't done that, etc. And of course that really tends to pull the blinds down, and that's the end of conversation. What we really want is, and now try and imagine behind me a picture of E.T. with the boy, whose name I can't remember what he's called, and they're kind of embracing really in friendship here. We want this relationship of trust, of getting to know each other, so that the autistic child feels that there's somebody they can go to if they're feeling overwhelmed, and that person understands how autism affects them on a day-to-day basis. So rather than those very negative feelings that exclusion can provoke in an autistic child, instead of that child can then feel encouraged, included in the life of school, and they are then able to experience success and make the progress that they're capable of. Okay, so I've been talking today about preventing and challenging school exclusion. As I say, if you have any questions, by all means do contact me on the School Exclusions Helpline. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Autism Show 2020.